Easter. We still celebrate Easter even today on Friday of Easter week. We have a couple more days of it because we celebrate the day of Easter for 8 days. We call it an octave, the octave of Easter. Where does that come from? Why do we celebrate for 8 days? Well, for one thing, it's such an important feast to us that it's not enough to hear about it and to celebrate it for a single day. I can remember when I was learning history in middle school and they taught us about the first pilgrims and Thanksgiving, that it was a multiple day celebration. And I remember how odd that seemed until I realized that in our country, in some ways, Thanksgiving is kind of like a multiple day holiday. A lot of people don't have to work the day after Thanksgiving. And I know in my family, it was a custom for people to come back the next day. And we had what I term pizza Thanksgiving. We would have regular Thanksgiving food on Thursday, and then people would order pizzas on Fridays or make pizzas and bring those in. We'd have a pizza party the next day. I think it's built in for us that when we are in celebratory mode, that we would do so for an extended period of time while everybody's gathered together, while we have the opportunity. And the great mysteries of our faith, the fact that Jesus is risen from the dead, is worth celebrating for much longer. Why 8 days? Well, as most things do, it goes back to the Old Testament. It goes back to the celebrations that they had when they first built the temple. When Solomon's temple was first erected and built, they celebrated for 8 days. I can imagine that for the Jewish people who had their 7-day week, just like we do, and the Sabbath was on the 7th day, there was a sense that after you celebrated the Sabbath, there was then a great feast of celebrating at the beginning and at the end. And it just sort of developed that way. In the early church, when Christianity finally was able to be public and they built the first basilicas, they celebrated and feasted for 8 days, reminiscing of the days that the first temple was built. And that got carried over into the liturgies of our church. For a time in the church's history, there were so many octaves that almost half of the year was contained in these 8-day feasts. They celebrated all kinds of feast days throughout the year with 8-day celebrations. Today we have scaled it back to the two most important ones, the octave of Christmas and the octave of Easter. And if you go to daily Mass during the octave of Christmas or the octave of Easter, you notice that it's a little bit more grand. It's a little more solemn is the term that we use for a great liturgy. We still recite the Gloria, for example. There's more gravitas to it. There's more seriousness, solemnity, importance placed on those days. So we do so for 8 days, even though our world was over with Easter by Monday. We as Christians and as Catholic Christians continue to say Happy Easter through to this coming Sunday, the Feast of Divine Mercy. So that's the octave of Easter. But there's also the Easter season that we celebrate for 50 days. I think most people know that Lent is 40 days long. But most people don't realize that Easter is even longer. It's for 50 days. Probably because we're counting down the days until Easter, and the days that we have offered penance seem longer. But the Feast of Easter is more important and therefore is longer. But it too has Old Testament roots. In the Mosaic Law, there are 3 specific celebrations that God orders the people to celebrate. And 2 of them are connected to the feasts of Easter and Pentecost in our Catholic Church. The first is the night of Passover. Now, you probably are familiar with the story in Exodus that tells the Jewish people that the angel of death is going to pass into the night through Egypt and kill all the firstborn except for the Jewish people who participate in the Passover. That they slaughter a lamb, that they eat it in solemnity that evening, and they place the blood on the doorposts. and therefore the spirit of the angel, if you will, the angel of death, will pass over their houses and not leave anyone harmed. And so God says you must commemorate that night every year by celebrating the Passover feast. Likewise, the Lord asks them to celebrate what we call the Feast of Weeks, or Pentecost. It's actually a Jewish feast name, and it was celebrated 50 days after the Passover, and the intention was to commemorate and to remember God's giving his people the law, the Torah, the Ten Commandments, and all the precepts that would govern his people. If you think about it, there's a little bit of a time gap between when the Israelites fled from Egypt and when they arrive at Mount Sinai and Moses receives the law from the Lord and gives it to the people, and they say, we will do all of the things that God is asking us to do. And so during this period of time, the Jewish people are reflecting on that journey, on all the mighty works that God performed, from the crossing through the Red Sea, to the giving to them of manna, to providing water flowing from the rock. So that's what this period of 50 days is about for them. It's really not all that different from us, if you think about it. For if the Passover commemorates when God saved his people from the angel of death by allowing them to pass over their homes, how much more powerful and important is it for us as Christians to commemorate the day that Jesus Christ rose from the dead to destroy not just the angel of death, but the very power of death, to bring about the possibility of life eternal. And so our Easter is deeply connected to the Passover, not only theologically, but also in reality. For Jesus himself celebrated that meal with his disciples on the Feast of Passover. That's why so many people were gathered in Jerusalem on that day. Likewise, 50 days later, there was a whole group of Jewish people who came for the feast to Jerusalem for the Pentecost feast. And it's no coincidence, perhaps, that at that point, the Holy Spirit comes down upon the apostles, and they go out into Jerusalem amid all of these people who traveled from all over the place and spoke all kinds of different languages, and first heard the voice of the Spirit, the Holy Spirit that spoke to them in tongues, in the various languages. Just as they celebrate for Jewish people the reception of the law, of what voice would guide the people to righteousness, we celebrate the Feast of Pentecost, which is the coming about of the Holy Spirit that leads us to righteousness, that gives us the law of the Spirit, as it will. This is why St. Paul tends to contrast the law and the Spirit, because the two are deeply connected. It's just that the one is now new, it is fresh, it is something of God and of Jesus, born of his passion and death. And that coming of the Holy Spirit we celebrate with just as much fervor as the Jewish people celebrate the reception of the Mosaic Law. So that's where it comes from. That's why we celebrate Easter for 50 days in the season, and that's why we can still say Happy Easter, even today and tomorrow and on Sunday, to one another. God bless, and we'll see you next time.